The dog froze, ears locked on a towering termite mound in the middle of Ethan Cole's farm, then let out a low growl that didn't belong to this world. And when Ethan struck it with his shovel, the ground answered with a hollow metallic echo. Not dirt, not stone, something buried, something waiting. Rex started digging like he'd done this before, like he knew exactly where to go, until the blade hit steel, a rusted hatch sealed for 60 years. And when Ethan wiped the dirt away, his breath stopped, because carved into the metal was a name he hadn't seen since the war, a name that was never supposed to be here. And the moment he reached for the handle, the ground beneath them pulsed again. Some things aren't buried to be forgotten. They're buried to wait. The wind moved slowly across Ethan Cole's farm, brushing through rows of dry grass that whispered against each other like distant voices. And right in the middle of that open land stood a termite mound nearly 6 feet tall, hardened by time and weather, its surface cracked like old stone, untouched for longer than anyone in town could remember. People said it had been there before the fences, before the road, maybe even before the first house was built. But Ethan never cared much for stories. He had come here for quiet, for space, for something that didn't remind him of the past. Yet the past had a way of settling into places like this, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Beside him stood Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick gray and cream coat that caught the afternoon light, his ears sharp, his posture still, not like a dog resting, but like something listening, really listening. His amber eyes locked onto the mound as if it had just spoken. Ethan leaned against his shovel, watching the dog with a faint crease in his brow. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, but Rex didn't move, didn't blink. Only a low sound built in his chest, not quite a growl, not fear, something deeper, something instinctive, the kind of sound Ethan had heard before in places where the ground wasn't as empty as it looked. A breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of dust and something metallic, subtle, almost lost in the air. But Rex caught it, stepping forward, slow at first, then circling the mound with careful precision, his paws pressing into the dirt as if mapping something unseen. Ethan straightened, the familiar weight of awareness settling into his chest. He had learned long ago to trust signals like this, the kind that came without explanation, the kind that didn't need words. He walked closer, boots pressing into the dry soil, and placed a hand against the side of the mound. The surface was warm from the sun, rough beneath his palm, but as he held it there, something shifted, a faint vibration, so subtle it could have been nothing or everything. His breath slowed, counting without thinking, the way he used to when silence mattered more than sound. And then it came again, steady, controlled, not random. Rex stopped moving, standing beside him now, ears forward, body tense, both of them listening to something beneath the earth that no one else could hear. Ethan stepped back, gripping the shovel, tighter, not out of fear, but recognition. Whatever was down there, it wasn't new. It had been waiting, and for some reason, it had chosen this moment to be found. The metal edge of the shovel caught the light as he raised it slightly, hesitating for just a second, the kind of hesitation that comes when you realize that one small action can change everything. Rex let out a single, sharp bark, and that was enough. Ethan drove the shovel into the side of the mound, and instead of the dull crumble of dirt, the ground answered with a hollow, echoing sound that didn't belong to soil at all. The sound did not fade after the first strike. It lingered, echoing upward through the mound and into the still air, a hollow tone that seemed too deliberate to belong to anything natural. And Ethan froze for a moment, shovel still pressed against the hardened surface, his breath slowing as that familiar instinct settled deeper into his chest, the kind that had once kept him alive when everything else failed. Rex stepped closer, nose low, tracing the exact spot where the metal had answered, his tail stiff, his body aligned with a precision that spoke of training long embedded into muscle and memory. Ethan pulled the shovel back and struck again, this time with more force, and once again the same sound rose up, clearer. Now, unmistakable, not stone, not wood, but metal, aged and buried, waiting beneath layers of time. The mound began to crumble in chunks as he worked, dry earth breaking apart and falling away in dusty sheets that drifted down around his boots, each strike revealing more of what lay hidden beneath. And the deeper he dug, the colder the air seemed to become. As if the ground itself was holding on to something that did not belong to the warmth of the sun above, Rex began digging alongside him. Paws moving fast but controlled, clearing away loose dirt with an urgency that did not come from panic, but from certainty, as though he had done this before, as though he knew exactly what they were uncovering even before it was visible. Minutes passed without either of them speaking. The only sounds were the scrape of metal against compacted soil, the soft collapse of the mound, and the steady rhythm of Rex's digging, until finally the edge of something solid emerged fully from the earth. A flat surface, dark with age, streaked with rust, its lines too straight to be anything but man-made. Ethan dropped to one knee, brushing away dirt with his gloved hand, revealing more of it inch by inch. The shape became clearer, a rectangular plate set into the ground. Thick, reinforced, not the kind of thing someone would build without purpose. His fingers traced along its edge until they found a seam. A narrow gap where a door might once have opened. Rex stopped suddenly, lifting his head, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the surface anymore, but beyond it, as if whatever lay beneath was now close enough to be felt. Ethan followed that gaze, feeling the faintest tremor again beneath his palm, steady, repeating, not random. He swallowed slowly, the memory rising uninvited, nights spent listening to the earth for signs of movement, for signals buried beneath rubble and steel. Only this time there was no chaos around him, only silence, wide and endless, making the rhythm feel even more unnatural. He cleared the remaining dirt from the top of the metal surface until a handle came into view, half buried, its shape simple but solid, the kind designed to last decades without being touched. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Whatever was sealed below had been placed there with intention, left undisturbed for 60 years, maybe longer, and opening it would not just reveal something hidden, it would bring something back into the present that had chosen to stay buried. Rex let out a low whine, softer now, almost questioning, his eyes flicking from Ethan to the handle and back again, as if waiting for permission, as if the decision belonged entirely to the man standing beside him. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air cool against his face, and for a moment he simply listened to the wind, moving across the fields, to the faint creak of the old fence line in the distance, to the quiet presence of the dog beside him, grounding him in the now. But beneath all of that was the pulse, steady and patient, like something counting time beneath the soil. He reached forward and wrapped his fingers around the handle, the metal cold despite the sun, heavier than it looked. He pulled once, testing it, but it did not move, sealed tight by years of earth pressing down around it. He shifted his grip and pulled again, harder this time, and the ground seemed to resist for a brief second before giving way with a deep, slow creak that echoed upward through the open space around them. Rex stepped back instinctively, his ears flattening for just a moment before lifting again, alert and focused. The edge of the hatch lifted slightly, just enough to let a thin line of darkness show beneath it. And from that darkness came a breath of air that did not belong to the surface world, cool, still, carrying a faint scent of metal and something older, something that had not touched sunlight in decades. Ethan held the hatch there, his arm steady, his eyes fixed on the narrow opening. And in that moment he understood that whatever waited below was not just an object or a forgotten space. It was a story paused in time, and somehow, for reasons he could not yet explain, he and Rex had just been chosen to continue it. The hatch resisted at first, as if the earth itself had not yet agreed to let it go, and Ethan tightened his grip, boots planted firm in the loosened soil, drawing in a slow breath before pulling again with steady pressure, not forcing it, but coaxing it open the way he had learned to handle things that had been sealed for too long. And with a deep, groaning sound the metal shifted another inch, then another, until the weight gave just enough for him to lift it higher, revealing a narrow opening that breathed out a cold, unmoving air, the kind that had been trapped in darkness for decades. Rex stepped closer again, cautious but curious, his nose hovering just above the opening, drawing in the scent with careful, measured breaths, his ears flicking at something beyond sound, something Ethan could not yet hear. The sunlight stretched across the edge of the hatch but stopped abruptly at the threshold, as if the darkness below refused to accept it fully. Ethan leaned forward slightly, peering down into the opening, at first seeing nothing but shadow. Then slowly, as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to form, not chaos, not collapse, but structure. A narrow set of steps leading downward, carved with intention, their edges worn but intact, disappearing into a deeper space below. He exhaled quietly, a mix of surprise and recognition settling in his chest. This was not random, not a forgotten hole or a natural void. This was built, planned, meant to last, meant to be found, just not by anyone. Not until now. Rex let out a soft sound. Not fear, not warning, something closer to acknowledgement, as if whatever lay beneath had just confirmed its presence. Ethan rested one hand on the edge of the hatch, feeling the cool metal under his palm, grounding himself in the moment. The wind above moved gently across the open fields, carrying the faint rustle of grass and the distant creak of the fence line. But down there, just below the surface, there was no movement at all, only stillness, thick and complete, like a room holding its breath. He reached down and brushed away the last of the dirt along the hatch's surface, clearing it fully now. And that was when he saw it, faint at first beneath the rust and age, then clearer as he wiped it clean, markings etched into the metal, not decorative, not random, but deliberate, letters and numbers arranged in a way that made his chest tighten before his mind even processed them. He leaned closer, his fingers tracing the grooves carefully, and as the dust fell away, the name came into view, worn but unmistakable, carved with the kind of permanence that does not fade with time. Ethan Cole did not move for a long moment. His breath caught somewhere between memory and disbelief, because that name did not belong here, not beneath his farm, not beneath a mound that no one had touched in decades. It belonged somewhere else, somewhere far from this quiet land, somewhere tied to a part of his life he had tried not to revisit. Rex shifted beside him, pressing lightly against his leg, a grounding presence, steady and real, pulling him back from the edge of thought. Ethan blinked slowly, forcing his focus back to the present, but the feeling did not leave. It settled deeper, a quiet certainty that this was not coincidence, that the land had not just given him a place to live. It had led him here, step by step, to this exact point. He swallowed and shifted his weight, looking once more into the opening, the steps below waiting, silent and patient, as if they had been expecting him all along. A faint sound rose from beneath, so subtle it could have been imagined, a soft, rhythmic echo, like something distant brushing against metal or stone, not loud enough to alarm, but too precise to ignore. Rex heard it too, his ears snapping forward, his posture sharpening again, alert but not afraid. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, the decision forming without words. He reached back toward the truck parked at the edge of the field and retrieved a small flashlight, its weight familiar in his hand. When he returned, the opening seemed darker than before, deeper somehow, as if the act of revealing it had awakened something within. He clicked the light on and directed the beam downward, the narrow shaft of light cutting through the darkness, illuminating the first few steps clearly now. Concrete reinforced with metal edges, old but intact, dust settled thick across them, undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of recent movement, only time layered quietly over everything. He lowered himself carefully, one hand gripping the edge of the hatch, one foot testing the first step. The structure held firm beneath his weight, solid and dependable. He paused there, halfway between the open sky and the sealed world below, feeling the shift in air, the difference in sound. Above him the wind still moved, carrying life across the land, but down here the silence was complete, wrapping around him in a way that felt both heavy and strangely calm. Rex stood at the edge, watching, his eyes following every movement. Then without hesitation, he stepped forward and placed his paws onto the first step beside Ethan, his presence immediate and steady, as if to say that whatever came next, they would face it together. Ethan allowed himself a small breath, almost a quiet smile that never fully formed. Then he began to descend, slowly, deliberately, each step carrying him further away from the world he knew and deeper into something that had been waiting beneath it for longer than he could yet understand. The deeper Ethan stepped, the more the world above seemed to fade, not suddenly, but gradually, like a sound drifting out of range until it no longer existed. And with each careful step down the narrow staircase, the air grew cooler, heavier. Carrying a stillness that pressed gently against his chest, the beam of his flashlight moved slowly across the walls, revealing concrete reinforced with metal ribs, built with precision, not hurried, not temporary. Whoever had constructed this place had done so with intention, with care, as if it was meant to endure far beyond its time. Rex moved just ahead of him now, each step measured, his body low but steady, not afraid, only alert, his ears catching the smallest shifts in the quiet. And every few seconds he would pause, turning his head slightly, as if listening to something just out of reach. Ethan followed the rhythm of those pauses, trusting the dog's instincts the way he always had. The steps continued for about 15 feet before opening into a wider space. And when Ethan reached the bottom, the beam of his flashlight expanded into a room that felt untouched by time. The floor was smooth concrete. Dust settled evenly across it like a thin gray blanket. Undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of movement. Just silence held in place for decades. The walls extended outward into a rectangular chamber, roughly 20 feet across, the ceiling low but stable, supported by thick steel beams that had not rusted as much as he expected, as if this place had been protected somehow, preserved beneath the earth. And along the far wall stood a row of metal cabinets, old military storage units, their surfaces worn but intact, each one sealed, each one waiting. Ethan took a slow breath, the scent of metal and aged air filling his lungs, and beneath that, something else, faint but present, like paper that had not been touched in years, or fabric sealed away from light. Rex moved forward into the room, his paws silent against the dust, leaving the first visible marks on the floor in what must have been 60 years, his nose guiding him toward the far side, where the cabinets stood. But just before reaching them, he stopped again, his head turning slightly toward the left wall, where something else caught his attention. Ethan followed the motion, raising the flashlight to illuminate the area, and there, partially hidden behind a support beam, was a desk, simple, wooden, its surface layered with a fine coat of dust, a chair tucked neatly beneath it, as if someone had stood up and never returned. The light revealed objects resting on the desk, a metal box, a stack of papers, and something folded carefully beside them. Ethan approached slowly, his boots pressing gently into the dust, aware of the quiet significance of every step he took. As if each movement echoed louder in a place that had known only stillness, he reached the desk and paused, his hand hovering just above the surface before he brushed the dust aside, revealing the texture of the wood beneath, worn smooth in places where hands had once rested, worked, written, and the papers came into clearer view, aged but intact, edges yellowed but not crumbled, preserved by the dry air. He lifted the top sheet carefully, his fingers steady, and as he brought it closer to the light, the handwriting emerged, clean and deliberate, not rushed, not careless. And for a moment he did not read the words, because the shape of the letters alone was enough to send a quiet tension through him. Something familiar, something that reached into a part of his memory he had not expected to touch again. Rex let out a soft breath behind him, a low exhale that sounded almost like recognition, and Ethan glanced back briefly, meeting the dog's eyes, both of them aware now that this place was not just abandoned. It was personal, in a way neither of them could fully explain yet. Ethan looked back down at the page, his eyes moving across the first line slowly, taking in each word with care, as if reading too quickly might disturb something fragile, something that had waited too long to be understood. And as the meaning began to settle in, his grip tightened slightly on the paper, not out of fear, but out of the weight of realization, because this was not a random record, not a forgotten report or a storage log. This was a message, written for someone, preserved intentionally, left behind with purpose. And for the first time since stepping into the room, Ethan felt the full depth of what they had uncovered. Not just a hidden space, not just something buried beneath his land, but a story that had been waiting quietly, patiently, for the exact moment when someone would finally arrive to listen. And in the stillness of that underground room, with the faint beam of light cutting through decades of silence, Ethan understood that he had not just found this place. He had been led to it. The words on the page did not rush themselves into meaning. They settled. Slowly, like dust drifting through still air, and Ethan read them the way a man listens to something fragile, carefully, without interruption, the handwriting steady and deliberate, each line spaced with intention, not hurried, not uncertain, as if the person who wrote it had known exactly how long these words would need to last. Rex moved closer to the desk, his presence quiet but constant, his nose brushing lightly against the edge of the wooden surface before he lowered himself beside Ethan's leg, resting but not relaxed, listening in his own way. The first line spoke not of instructions or inventory, but of time, of waiting, of something placed beneath the ground not to be hidden forever, but to be found when the world above was ready to understand it. Ethan's eyes moved down the page, the beam of the flashlight steady in his other hand, illuminating each word as it revealed itself, and with every sentence, the feeling inside him shifted, not shock, not fear, but recognition, like hearing an old voice through a long silence. The letter spoke of a man who had built this place during a time when the world above had not been safe, when certain things needed to be protected, not for their value, but for what they meant, for what they represented, the kind of things that could not be replaced once lost. Ethan swallowed slowly, the air in the room feeling heavier now, as if the story itself carried weight. The man had written about the land, about choosing this exact location because it was quiet, because it would not draw attention, because it felt like a place where something important could rest without being disturbed. And then the words shifted, becoming more personal, less distant, the tone changing in a way that made Ethan pause for just a second before continuing, as if the letter itself had turned toward him, directly, intentionally. The name appeared again, clearer this time, written not as a mark or a label, but as part of a sentence, part of a message, and Ethan felt his breath catch slightly, because the name was not just familiar, it was tied to a memory he had not expected to find here, not in this place, not in this moment. Rex lifted his head, sensing the change, his ears tilting forward as he watched Ethan closely, as if reading something in the man's posture that words alone could not explain. Ethan continued reading, the lines now speaking of connection, of choices made long ago that would not make sense until much later, of paths crossing in ways no one could predict. And then came a sentence that stilled him completely, a sentence that did not just describe the past, but pointed directly toward the present, as if the writer had known that one day, someone like Ethan would stand exactly where he was standing now. Reading these exact words, the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, until it settled into a quiet certainty. This was not coincidence. This was not chance. The land, the mound, the dog's instinct, all of it had led to this moment, to this message. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his eyes drifting across the room again, taking in the cabinets, the beams, the untouched dust, seeing it all differently now, not as abandoned, but as preserved, as if time itself had been holding this place intact until it could be opened by the right hands. Rex stood again, moving toward the row of metal cabinets, his steps slow and deliberate, stopping in front of one particular door, his nose pressing gently against it before he looked back at Ethan, waiting, the same quiet signal he had given before, the same certainty in his eyes. Ethan folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the desk, not out of hesitation, but respect, as if the words needed to remain where they had been left until the rest of the story could be understood. He stood and walked toward Rex, each step measured, the air still carrying that faint metallic scent, mixed now with something else, something older, like the memory of a place rather than the place itself. He reached the cabinet and brushed away the dust from its surface, revealing a small handle and a lock that had long since rusted but not completely sealed. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting against the cold metal, not because he feared what was inside, but because he understood that whatever waited behind this door was connected to everything he had just read, connected to the name, to the message, to the reason this place existed at all. Rex remained still beside him, his presence steady, his gaze unwavering, as if reminding Ethan that they had not come this far to stop now. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that settles a man before he crosses a line he cannot uncross. And then he pulled the handle, the metal giving with a quiet resistance before opening just enough to reveal the darkness within. And in that narrow opening, just before the light could fully enter, something caught the beam, a shape, a surface, something carefully placed and waiting, exactly where it had been left. All those years ago, the cabinet door opened with a low, drawn-out creak, the kind that did not just come from rust, but from years of silence being disturbed, and Ethan held it there for a moment, not rushing the movement, letting the space inside reveal itself slowly under the narrow beam of his flashlight. The light slid across the interior, catching edges, surfaces, shapes that had not been seen in decades. And what lay inside was not scattered or forgotten. It was arranged, placed with care, as if someone had taken the time to make sure everything would remain exactly where it needed to be. Even after all these years, Rex stepped closer, his nose lifting slightly as he drew in the scent from within, not sharp, not alarming, but focused, attentive, his body aligned with the cabinet the same way it had been with the mound above. As if the same unseen thread had led him from one point to the next, Ethan leaned in, his breath steady, the flashlight revealing a metal case resting on the middle shelf, rectangular, reinforced, its surface worn but intact. Beside it were smaller objects, a folded piece of cloth, a compass, a set of keys attached to a simple ring. Each item placed with intention, none of them disturbed, none of them random. He reached out, slowly, and lifted the metal case, its weight heavier than expected, solid, grounded, the kind of weight that suggested something more than empty space inside. He set it down carefully on the desk behind him, the sound of metal against wood echoing softly through the room. Rex followed, staying close, his eyes fixed on the case now, his earlier alertness shifting into something quieter, almost settled, as if they had reached a point that had been building from the beginning. Ethan brushed away a thin layer of dust from the top of the case, revealing a latch, simple but secure, and just beneath it, etched into the surface, were markings similar to the ones on the hatch above, only clearer here, less worn, preserved by the enclosure of the cabinet. He traced them lightly with his fingers, feeling the grooves, the deliberate pressure that had been used to carve them, and again that sense of familiarity returned, not fully understood, but impossible to ignore. He released the latch and lifted the lid, slowly, carefully, and as it opened, the light revealed what had been sealed inside. Not gold, not anything that shone or glittered, but something quieter, something that carried a different kind of weight. Documents, neatly stacked, bound together with a faded strap, a photograph placed on top, and beneath them, a small wooden box, its surface smooth and worn from time rather than use. Ethan paused, his hand hovering just above the contents, the moment stretching out, not because he hesitated, but because he understood that this was the center of it, the reason this place existed at all. Rex sat beside the desk, his posture calm now, no longer searching, no longer listening for something beyond, as if whatever had called them here had already been found. Ethan reached for the photograph first, lifting it gently, the edges soft with age, the image slightly faded but still clear enough to see. It showed two men standing side by side, their posture straight, their expressions quiet but steady, and for a moment Ethan did not move, because one of those faces was his own, younger, less worn, but unmistakable, and the man beside him, the one with the same calm presence, the same steady gaze, was the name he had seen etched into the metal, the name written in the letter, the one he had not expected to find here. Not beneath this land, not after all this time. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a way that felt like something being released, something he had carried without realizing it. He lowered the photograph slightly, his eyes lingering on it, then shifted to the stack of documents beneath. He set the photograph aside with care and lifted the top bundle, the strap holding them together worn but intact. He loosened it and opened the pages, the same handwriting from the letter appearing. Again, consistent, deliberate, each page filled with notes, records, reflections, not just about the place, but about the purpose behind it, about why it had been built, why it had been sealed, and why it had been left waiting. The words spoke of trust, of timing, of a belief that some things could not be passed down through instruction alone, but had to be discovered, had to be earned by the act of finding them. Ethan read slowly, absorbing each line, feeling the connection deepen with every word. This was not just a record. It was a continuation, a message that had been written across time, intended for him, whether he had known it or not. And as he reached the final page of the bundle, his hand stilled, because the last line was not written like the others. It was set apart, deliberate, as if it carried more weight than everything before it. And in that quiet underground room, with the light steady in his hand and Rex beside him, Ethan read the words that had been waiting for him, longer than he had understood, words that did not just explain the past, but quietly pointed toward what came next. The final line did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like an opening, a quiet shift in direction that did not demand anything, but invited something deeper. And Ethan read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle fully before moving to the next, the handwriting steady even here, even at the end, as if the person who wrote it had known this moment would come and had chosen each word with care. The message did not speak of ownership or reward. It spoke of responsibility, of understanding what had been preserved and why, of choosing what to do with it not based on value, but on meaning. Ethan lowered the page slightly, his eyes lingering on the last sentence, and for a moment the room felt even quieter than before, as if the space itself was listening for his response. Rex remained beside him, still and grounded, his breathing slow and even, his presence anchoring the moment in something real, something steady. Ethan set the pages down gently, aligning them back into place with the same care they had been kept in, then reached for the small wooden box resting beneath them, its surface smooth and worn, not from use, but from time, the grain of the wood faintly visible beneath the thin layer of dust. He lifted it slowly, feeling its weight, lighter than the metal case, but not empty, not hollow. Something rested inside, something that had been placed there with intention. He ran his fingers along the edges, noticing the craftsmanship, simple but precise, no unnecessary detail, just function and quiet purpose. He opened the lid carefully, and inside, resting on a soft lining, was a watch, old, mechanical, its face slightly aged but intact, the glass scratched but not broken, the hand still, frozen in place at a time that had not moved in decades. Ethan's breath caught for a moment, not because of the object itself, but because of what it represented. He recognized it instantly, not from memory of holding it, but from memory of seeing it, worn on a wrist across from him. In moments where time had mattered more than anything else, moments where seconds had carried weight, where stillness and movement had meant everything. Rex shifted slightly, his head tilting as if sensing the change in Ethan, not the object, but the feeling attached to it. Ethan lifted the watch gently from the box, the metal cool against his fingers, heavier than it looked, solid, real, and as he turned it over, the back revealed an engraving, faint but clear enough to read, a date, a name, and beneath it, a single line that carried more meaning than its simplicity suggested. He traced the letters slowly, his mind not racing, but settling, connecting pieces that had once seemed separate, distant, unrelated, the farm, the mound, the hatch, the room, the letter, all of it now forming a pattern that no longer felt random, but deliberate, as if each step had been placed long before he ever arrived. He closed the wooden box halfway, not sealing it, but not leaving it fully open either, holding the watch in his hand as he stood there in the quiet, the beam of the flashlight steady, the room unchanged, yet somehow different now. As if understanding had shifted the space itself, Rex stood and walked a few steps toward the far side of the room, then paused, looking back at Ethan, his eyes calm, no longer searching, no longer urging, just present, as if the urgency that had brought them here had been replaced by something else, something quieter, something that did not push forward, but waited. Ethan looked around once more, taking in the cabinets, the desk, the undisturbed dust, seeing it now not as something to uncover further, but something to carry forward, something that had been held safely beneath the ground until it could be understood. And now that it had been, the question was no longer what was hidden here, but what would be done with it. He slipped the watch carefully into his jacket pocket, not as a claim, but as a continuation, a piece of the story now moving with him. He gathered the documents, securing them gently, then closed the metal case, leaving the rest of the items undisturbed. Not everything needed to be taken, Not everything needed to be moved. Some things could remain, exactly as they had been, holding their place in the quiet beneath the earth. Ethan turned toward the staircase, the beam of light guiding the way upward, and as he took the first step, the air shifted again, warmer above, cooler below. The boundary between two worlds marked not by distance, but by understanding. Rex moved ahead, his steps confident now. No hesitation, no pause, as if the path forward was clear in a way it had not been before, and as Ethan followed, carrying with him the weight of what had been found, he understood that the discovery had never been about what was hidden beneath the ground. It had always been about what would rise with it. The climb back up felt different from the descent, not because the steps had changed, but because Ethan had. Each footfall carried a weight that was not physical, but quiet and steady, like something settling into place inside him. The air grew warmer with every step, the faint scent of earth and sun returning as he moved closer to the surface. And when his head finally rose above the opening, the late afternoon light spread across the field in long, golden lines, the wind moving gently through the grass as if nothing beneath it had shifted at all. Rex stepped out first, his paws landing softly on the soil, his body relaxing for the first time since they had approached the mound, his ears no longer searching, no longer tracking something hidden, but simply present in the open air. Ethan followed, pulling himself up and standing beside the opening, the hatch still raised behind him, the dark space below now silent once more, holding its secrets again, though not as hidden as before. He turned and looked across the farm, the wide stretch of land that had once felt empty, now carrying a different presence, not louder, not changed in appearance, but deeper, as if the ground itself held a memory he could now sense, not see, not hear, but understand in a way he had not before. Rex moved a few steps away, circling the edge of the disturbed soil, his nose brushing lightly across the ground where the mound had stood. Then he stopped, looking back at Ethan, his tail giving a slow, steady motion, not urgent, not signaling, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say that whatever had needed to be found had been found. Ethan exhaled slowly, the wind catching the breath as it left him, carrying it across the field. And for a moment he simply stood there, the watch resting in his pocket, the weight of it subtle but constant, a reminder of what he now carried. Not just the object, but the meaning behind it, the connection that stretched backward through time and now forward into whatever came next. He stepped toward the hatch and lowered it carefully, not sealing it away completely, but returning it to rest, the metal settling back into place with a soft, final sound. The earth around it still loose, not yet returned to what it had been, and he knew it would not be, not fully. Some things once uncovered could not be put back exactly as they were. They remained, changed in a way that could not be seen from the surface, but felt, understood. Rex walked over and sat beside him, his body leaning slightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the moment, steady and real. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head, his fingers resting in the thick fur, not as a gesture of reassurance, but of recognition, because none of this would have happened without him, without the instinct that had guided them to this exact place, at this exact time. The sun lowered slowly toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the land, the light softening, turning the field into something almost quiet enough to hold what had just taken place. And Ethan found himself looking out over it with a different sense of belonging, not the kind that comes from ownership, but the kind that comes from understanding, from knowing that he had stepped into something larger than himself and had been trusted with it. The documents rested safely in his truck, the memory of the room below still fresh in his mind. But what stayed with him most was not the objects, not the structure, but the intention behind it all, the care, the patience, the belief that someone would come, someone would listen, someone would understand. And now that someone was him. Rex shifted slightly, resting his head against Ethan's knee, his eyes half closed, the tension that had once held him alert now gone, replaced by a quiet calm, the kind that comes after a task is complete. Ethan looked down at him for a moment, then back toward the field, the horizon stretching wide and open, and in that stillness, he realized that the discovery had not ended anything. It had begun something that would not unfold all at once, but over time, in choices, in actions, in the way he carried what had been given to him without asking for it. The wind moved again, soft and steady, brushing through the grass and over the place where the mound had once stood, as if the land itself was breathing differently now, not because it had changed, but because it had been heard, and Ethan stood there with Rex beside him, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just present in a moment that felt both quiet and profound, knowing that whatever came next would not be guided by chance, but by something far more patient, something that had been waiting long before he ever arrived that night. The farm did not feel the same, though. Nothing visible had changed. The house stood where it always had. The fence line traced the same quiet borders, and the wind moved across the land with the same steady rhythm. But beneath it all there was a new presence, not something added, but something revealed, like a second layer of meaning resting quietly beneath the surface of everything Ethan saw. He sat on the wooden steps outside his porch, the sky above stretching wide and clear, filled with stars that seemed closer out here, brighter in the absence of noise and light. Rex lay beside him, his body stretched out along the boards, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. Always aware, always present, the kind of calm that comes not from rest, but from knowing that the world, for this moment, is exactly as it should be. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and took out the watch, holding it in his hand under the soft glow of the porch light. The metal reflected faintly, worn but steady, and as he turned it slowly, the frozen hands caught his attention again, locked at the exact same position they had been when he first saw it. A time that no longer moved, yet somehow still mattered. He ran his thumb across the glass, feeling the small imperfections, the scratches left by years long past, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape the present, but to let the past settle into it. The memories did not come in sharp images. They came in fragments, quiet impressions, a voice, a shared silence, the kind of understanding that does not need to be spoken. And though he had spent years moving forward, building distance between himself and those moments, tonight they did not feel distant. They felt close, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had found its way back without force. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head and glancing up at Ethan, his ears twitching as if catching a sound too soft for human hearing. Ethan followed the motion, looking out across the dark field, the place where the mound had stood now just a patch of turned earth, barely visible in the low light, yet impossible to ignore. He studied it for a moment, then looked back down at the watch, a quiet thought forming, not fully shaped, but clear enough to follow. He stood, slowly, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots, and walked down from the porch, Rex rising immediately and falling into step beside him without hesitation. They crossed the yard together, moving through the cool night air, the scent of soil and grass stronger now, deeper, as if the land itself had opened slightly, breathing in a different way. When they reached the edge of the disturbed ground, Ethan stopped, the stars reflecting faintly in his eyes as he looked down at the place where everything had begun. The hatch remained closed, hidden again beneath the surface, but he knew exactly where it was, exactly what rested below, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to open it again, not yet, because whatever had needed to be revealed had already been given, not in full answers, but in enough to understand what mattered. Rex stepped forward, sniffing the ground lightly, then sat down at the edge, his posture calm, his gaze moving from the earth to Ethan and back. Again, as if waiting, not for direction, but for meaning, Ethan crouched down, resting his hand against the soil, the coolness of it pressing gently into his palm, grounding him in the moment, connecting him to something that was no longer just land, but memory, intention, purpose. He held the watch in his other hand, looking at it one more time, then carefully, deliberately, he reached forward and placed it against the ground, not burying it, not hiding it, just letting it rest there for a moment, as if returning it to the place it had waited so long beneath. The gesture was quiet, almost instinctive, not something he had planned, but something that felt right. Rex watched closely, his head tilting slightly, his eyes steady and clear, and in that silence, something shifted again, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the understanding between them. Ethan picked the watch back up after a few seconds, slipping it once more into his pocket, the action small, but meaningful, not a return, but a continuation. He stood and looked out across the field again, the night stretching wide and open, and for the first time since arriving here, he felt something settle inside him that had not been there before, not closure, not resolution, but direction, a quiet sense that whatever came next would not be random, would not be empty, because now he carried something forward, something that had been waiting for him long before he knew it existed. Rex moved closer, brushing lightly against his leg, and together they stood there in the stillness, the land beneath them holding its secrets a little differently now, not hidden, but shared, not silent, but understood. And as the wind moved softly across the field, Ethan realized that the story beneath his feet was not finished, it had only just begun to be told. Morning came slowly over the farm, not with noise or urgency, but with a soft light that stretched across the land like a quiet promise, the kind that does not demand attention, but earns it. And Ethan stood by the window of the small kitchen, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the far edge of the field, moving gradually toward the place where the earth had been disturbed. Rex sat near the door, his posture alert but calm, his ears shifting occasionally as if tracking the subtle sounds of the waking world, birds in the distance, the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. And yet Ethan felt the same quiet difference that had followed him since the night before, not something external, but something settled within, like a compass that had found a direction it had been missing. He took a slow sip of the coffee, the warmth grounding him, then set the mug down and reached into his jacket, retrieving the watch once more. It rested in his palm, still and unchanged, the hands frozen at the same moment they had been held in for years, and for a second he simply looked at it, not searching for answers, but acknowledging its presence, the connection it carried, the weight of time it represented. Without moving forward at all, Rex stood and walked over, his eyes shifting from Ethan's face to the watch, then back again, a silent exchange passing between them, not of words, but of awareness. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, then slipped the watch into his pocket and moved toward the door, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his steps. He opened the door and stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face, carrying the scent of soil and open land. The farm stretched out before him, unchanged in shape, but different in meaning, as if the ground itself now held a story he could feel beneath each step. Rex moved ahead of him, trotting toward the field with quiet purpose, not in search of something new, but as if revisiting a place that had already been understood. Ethan followed, his boots pressing into the grass, the dew damp against the leather, the sun rising higher now, casting a soft glow across the area where the mound had once stood. When they reached it, Ethan paused, looking down at the patch of turned earth, the surface uneven, not yet settled back into its natural state, but no longer chaotic either, just a mark, a sign of something that had been uncovered and would not return to what it had been before. Rex circled the area once, slower this time, his movements measured, his nose brushing lightly across the ground. Then he stopped at the exact spot where the hatch lay. Beneath, his ears lifting slightly, not in alert, but in recognition, Ethan stepped closer and stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the ground, not seeing through it, but knowing what rested below, the room, the desk, the letter, the objects, all of it still there, unchanged since he had left it, waiting in the same quiet stillness. But now it no longer felt like something hidden, it felt like something entrusted. He crouched down and rested his hand against the soil again, the texture cool and firm beneath his palm, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to imagine, but to remember, the feeling of stepping into that space, the weight of the words he had read, the presence of something that had been left with intention. Rex lowered himself beside him, his body relaxed, his breathing slow, as if confirming that there was nothing left to search for here, only something to carry forward. Ethan opened his eyes and stood, brushing the dirt lightly from his hand, the decision forming not in a sudden realization, but in a quiet understanding that had been building since the moment he first struck the mound. He turned and walked back toward the house, Rex rising and following without hesitation. The path across the field now familiar in a different way, not just as ground he owned, but as ground that had given something back. When they reached the porch, Ethan paused for a moment, looking out once more across the land. The sunlight now fully spread, the morning alive in its own quiet rhythm, and then he stepped inside, moving with purpose, not rushed, but steady. He went to the table and set down the documents he had brought up, unfolding them carefully, his eyes scanning the pages again, not searching this time, but confirming, understanding. Each line reinforcing what he had already begun to accept. This was not just a discovery. It was a continuation, something that required action, not in haste, but in care. Rex settled near the doorway, watching him quietly, his presence unchanged, constant. As Ethan reached for a pen and a clean sheet of paper, placing it beside the old documents. The gesture simple, but significant, the beginning of something new, not replacing what had been written, but adding to it, extending it forward. And as he sat there in the soft light of the morning, the farm quiet around him, Ethan understood that whatever had been waiting beneath the earth had not been waiting to be found alone. It had been waiting to be continued. And now that responsibility rested with him, the pen rested in Ethan's hand for a long moment before it touched the paper, not because he did not know what to write, but because he understood that the first words would matter more than anything that followed. The room was quiet, except for the faint sound of wind brushing against the walls outside, and Rex lay near the doorway, watching with the same steady presence he had carried through everything. Ethan glanced once at the old documents spread across the table, then back to the blank page, and slowly, carefully, he began, not copying the past, but answering it, his handwriting firm but unhurried, each letter placed with intention, as if he were speaking to someone who would one day read it the same way he had read the words left for him. He did not write about the discovery itself, not in detail, because he understood that the meaning was not in what was found, but in what was carried forward. Instead, he wrote about the land, about the quiet that had drawn him here, about the feeling that something beneath it had been waiting without, needing to be seen. His words moved steadily, forming lines that did not rush, that allowed space between thoughts, as if the silence itself was part of the message. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head as if sensing the weight of the moment, then settled again, his eyes half closed but attentive, the kind of presence that does not interrupt, but remains, grounding everything around it. Ethan paused once, lifting the pen just above the page, his gaze drifting toward the window where the sunlight had shifted higher, brighter now, filling the room with a calm, steady light. And for a brief moment he listened, not for anything specific, but for the absence of noise, the kind of stillness that had first led him here. And then he continued writing, the words flowing more easily now, not forced, not constructed, but discovered as they came. He wrote about trust, about the idea that some things are not passed down through instruction, but through experience, through the act of finding them, understanding them, and choosing what to do with them. His hand moved across the page with a quiet rhythm, the scratch of the pen soft but constant, and when he reached the final line, he did not try to make it complete. He left it open, just as the message before him had done, a continuation rather than an ending. He set the pen down gently and looked at what he had written, not with judgment, but with recognition. The feeling that this was not just something he had created, but something he had stepped into, something that had already begun long before him, and would continue long after. He gathered the pages carefully and placed them alongside the original documents, aligning them not to replace, but to sit beside, equal in purpose, connected across time. Rex stood and walked over, his nose brushing lightly against Ethan's hand before resting there for a moment. A quiet gesture that needed no explanation. Ethan reached down and ran his fingers along the dog's head, the contact steady, grounding. Then he stood and moved toward the door again, the watch still resting in his pocket, its presence constant, no longer just an object, but a part of the path he now carried. Outside, the day had fully settled into itself, the sky clear, the field stretching wide and open under the light, and Ethan walked back toward the place where the earth had been turned, not with urgency, but with purpose, Rex moving beside him in perfect rhythm. When they reached it, Ethan stopped and looked down, the surface unchanged from earlier, The mark still visible, the memory still present. But now it felt less like something uncovered and more like something acknowledged. He crouched again, placing his hand against the soil one more time, not searching, not listening, just present. And then he stood, stepping back slightly, the decision forming not in a single moment, but in the quiet accumulation of everything that had led him here. He turned toward the barn at the edge of the field, a structure that had stood and used since he arrived, weathered but solid, and began walking toward it, Rex following without hesitation, the distance between them and the house growing, the path shifting from something familiar into something new. When they reached the barn, Ethan paused at the door, his hand resting against the worn wood, feeling its texture, its age, its quiet endurance. And for a moment he simply stood there, the wind moving lightly around him, the land stretching behind him, and the understanding settling deeper. This was where it would continue, not hidden beneath the ground, but brought into the light, not exposed, but preserved in a different way, a way that could be shared when the time was right. He opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking softly, revealing the dim interior, empty but full of potential. And as he stepped inside, Rex close at his side, Ethan understood that what he had found was not meant to stay buried. It was meant to live, to be carried forward. One quiet step at a time. The barn carried a different kind of silence than the space beneath the ground, not sealed and untouched, but open, breathing with the slow passage of time, dust drifting through thin beams of sunlight that slipped between the wooden slats. And as Ethan stepped inside, the air shifted around him, warmer than the earth below, yet holding its own quiet weight, the kind that comes from years of standing still, waiting without knowing it was waiting. Rex moved ahead, his paws stirring the dust lightly, his nose lifting as he explored the space with calm curiosity, not searching for anything hidden, but taking in what was already there. Ethan paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, the outline of old tools resting against the far wall, a workbench worn smooth by hands long gone, and empty shelves that stretched along one side, bare but sturdy, ready for something they had not yet been given. He walked slowly toward the center of the barn, each step deliberate, not hurried, as if he understood that what he was about to begin did not need speed. It needed care. He set the documents down on the workbench, the wood solid beneath them, grounding them in a space that was no longer forgotten, but becoming something else, something active. He opened the stack again, not to read from the beginning, but to move through it with purpose, placing each page in order, aligning them with the ones he had written that morning, the old and the new side by side, not separate, but connected, forming something that stretched beyond either of them alone. Rex settled near the entrance, lying down where he could see both Ethan and the open field beyond, his position natural, balance between what had been discovered and what still lay ahead. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed the watch once more, holding it in the light that filtered through the barn, the metal catching a faint glow, still worn, still silent, and yet it no longer felt frozen. It felt anchored, like a point of reference in something that was beginning to move. Again, he placed it gently on the workbench beside the documents, not hiding it, not protecting it, but letting it exist openly, part of the story now unfolding in the light instead of beneath the ground. He stepped back slightly, looking at the arrangement, the papers, the watch, the empty space around them, and for a moment he did nothing, allowing the meaning of it to settle, the transition from hidden to visible, from buried to carried forward. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head as if sensing that something had changed again, not in the environment, but in Ethan, a quiet alignment, a decision that had fully taken shape. Ethan moved to the side of the barn where the empty shelves stood and ran his hand along the wood, feeling its texture, the roughness softened by time, and he began clearing the space, moving old and used items aside, not discarding them, but making room, creating a place where what had been found could exist, not as relics, but as part of something living, something that could grow. He returned to the workbench and carefully gathered the documents, placing them on the shelf in a way that kept them protected but accessible, not locked away, but not exposed carelessly either, a balance that felt right, a continuation of the intention behind them. He left the watch on the bench for a moment longer, his eyes resting on it, Then he picked it up again and turned it gently in his hand. And without fully planning the gesture, he reached toward a small nail embedded in one of the wooden beams and hung the watch there, letting it rest in the open air, visible, steady, no longer hidden in a pocket or sealed in a box, but present, part of the space, part of the story that would continue here. Rex stood and walked over, his gaze following the movement, then sat beneath the beam, looking up briefly at the watch before turning his attention back to Ethan, his expression calm, grounded, as if acknowledging the change. Ethan stepped back once more, the barn no longer feeling empty, but quietly filled, not with noise or activity, but with purpose, the sunlight shifting slightly as the day moved forward, casting new angles of light across the wood and the pages, bringing them into a gentle focus. And in that moment, Ethan understood that this place, once overlooked, once unused, had become something else entirely, not by force, not by design alone, but by the simple act of carrying something forward with intention. He walked back toward the entrance, pausing just at the threshold, looking out across the field, the land stretching wide, unchanged yet deeply different, and Rex moved beside him, his presence steady, his steps aligned, the two of them standing there between what had been and what was becoming. And as the wind moved softly through the open doorway, brushing past them and into the barn, Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle into place, not as a final answer, but as a beginning that no longer needed to be questioned. Because it was already in motion, the days that followed did not arrive with sudden change or dramatic shift. They came quietly, one after another, each carrying the same soft rhythm of wind across the fields and light moving steadily across the land. And yet beneath that calm surface, something had begun to take shape, something that did not need to be seen all at once to be understood. Ethan moved through his routines with a different awareness now. The simple acts of walking the fence line, checking the soil, repairing small things around the property, all of it grounded in a sense of connection that had not been there before. Rex stayed close as always, his presence steady, his instincts no longer searching but settled, as if the purpose that had once guided him toward the mound had now expanded into something quieter, something ongoing. Each morning Ethan would step into the barn before anything else, the space no longer empty, no longer still in the way it once had been, but quietly alive with intention. The documents rested on the shelf where he had placed them, untouched yet not forgotten, and the watch hung in its place on the beam, catching the light in small, shifting reflections as the sun moved through the gaps in the wood. Ethan would pause there for a moment each time, not out of habit, but out of respect, allowing the presence of what had been found to settle into the start of each day. And sometimes he would add to the pages, not in long passages, not in anything that felt forced, but in small entries, reflections, observations. The kind of thoughts that come when a man is no longer trying to move past something, but instead learns to carry it with care. The story grew slowly, not through urgency, but through consistency, through the quiet act of showing up, of continuing. Rex often lay near the doorway while Ethan worked, his eyes half closed, yet always aware. Occasionally lifting his head at sounds too faint to name, then settling again, as if he understood that the work here was not about guarding or searching, but about witnessing, about being present as something meaningful unfolded in its own time. One afternoon, as the light stretched long across the barn floor, Ethan stood back from the shelf and looked at the pages, the old and the new together. And for a moment he realized that what had been left beneath the ground had not been a finished story at all. It had been a beginning waiting for someone willing to continue it. And that understanding did not feel heavy. It felt steady, like a path that did not need to be rushed, only followed. He stepped outside and looked across the farm, the land wide and open under the fading light. The place where the mound had stood now just a part of the field again, not erased, but integrated. A quiet reminder that something had once been uncovered there, something that had changed the way he saw everything around him. Rex walked up beside him and sat down, his body leaning slightly against Ethan's leg. The same gesture he had made from the beginning, grounding, constant, and Ethan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head, his fingers moving slowly through the thick fur, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared, everything they had found together without ever needing to explain it. The wind moved across the field once more, carrying with it the soft sound of grass, brushing against itself, a quiet, steady rhythm that seemed to echo something deeper now, something that could not be seen, but could be felt. And as Ethan stood there, looking out over the land that had become more than just a place to live, he understood that the value of what he had found was not measured in what it was worth, but in what it had asked of him, to listen, to understand, to continue. And perhaps that was always the point, not the discovery itself, but what came after, the choices, the care, the willingness to carry something forward without needing to own it. And as the last light of the day settled over the horizon, Ethan and Rex remained there in the quiet, not searching for what was next, not questioning what had been, simply present in a moment that felt complete in its own quiet way, as if the land, the story, and the two of them had finally come into alignment. And somewhere beneath it all, unseen but no longer unheard, something that had waited for 60 years had finally been answered, not with noise or change, but with understanding. And perhaps that was the only kind of ending that ever truly mattered. The kind that does not close a story, but allows it to live on in the quiet spaces where it is carried forward.